Welcome to Business Problem Solvers Podcast, where legal insight meets entrepreneurial innovation. Are you a startup founder navigating the complex legal landscape of entrepreneurship? Are you seeking practical advice, actionable strategies, and expert guidance to propel your business forward? Look no further. Eric Alspaugh is a seasoned attorney based in the vibrant startup hub of California, and he's thrilled to be your host on this exciting journey. In this podcast, we'll dive deep into the intersection of law and business, bringing you insightful interviews with a diverse range of industry experts, thought leaders, and successful entrepreneurs. From intellectual property and contract law to corporate governance and regulatory compliance, we'll cover the essential legal topics that every startup needs to know. Our guests will share their wisdom, experience, and practical tips to help you navigate legal challenges, seize opportunities, and build a thriving business in today's dynamic marketplace. So whether you're a seasoned entrepreneur, a budding startup founder, or simply curious about the intersection of law and business, join Eric on Business Problem Solvers Podcast as we explore the legal insights and entrepreneurial inspiration that will fuel your journey to success.
Hey, Niv, welcome to the Business Problem Solvers Podcast.
Hello, Eric. Great to be here.
Thanks so much for joining me. We're in our second episode here, and it's great to have a great friend, Niv Caviar, who I've known for well over 20 years. And I really, I love
Eric, we met when we were 14 then, right?
14. Yeah, we were 14. That was great. We were kids. And so Niv is a life science expert. He calls himself a generalist. I'd call him a specialist. He worked with me over 20 years ago as a vice president of business development in a pharmaceutical company. But since then, he's gone on to work at very large companies. He's been CEO of public companies. And really, what's been fun working with Niv for the last 15 years has been his focus on small and mid-sized companies to tackle their unique problems, especially in the medical device space and life science, biotech, and just it's been fun to watch him raise capital and have some successful exits. And I'm hoping that Niv will share some tips and tricks for the entrepreneurs that might be listening to this podcast or watching this podcast.
Great. Happy to help.
Thanks, Niv. And also for street cred, Niv graduated from the United States Air Force Academy and served in the Air Force, achieving a rank of captain, I believe. Thank you for your service, as well as being a NASA scientist, an actual rocket scientist or engineer. He also graduated Harvard with an MBA. And so he's got all the street cred, and I always learn something when I hang out with Niv. So that's the intro, Niv. Thank you.
Thank you. And, you know, Eric and I have gone back a long time. As Eric indicated, I knew him prior to his legal career when he was a research scientist. And then after he got his law degree, we reconnected, and he's worked with me at, I think, 4 or 5 companies now, two of them as IP counsel, and then I think 2 to 3 as external counsel on general corporate matters. So you've been great to work with. Thank you, Eric, for your time and help over the years.
Awesome. Thanks, Niv. So there have been a lot of changes in the FDA and regulatory space, and we can change gears anytime, but I like to focus on FDA-related medical device topics. But I think you have some insight in the regulatory pathways and some interesting things that you've done recently in different Class 2, Class 3 medical devices in the US and Europe and trying to get clinical data. So it'd be great to get some insights from you on that. And then maybe some tips or tricks and insights on raising capital. What are the things that entrepreneurs, CEOs, or inventors might not know that they don't know, and how they can either form relationships or set themselves up for success in raising capital.
Okay, very good. Yeah, happy to help. Yeah, on the FDA topic. So once again, my background is both big pharma originally, then med tech and biopharma. I've kind of spent my time equally amongst it. And during the almost 25 years of working in the life sciences now, I've seen the FDA move in different ways. Just like any organization or political system, they have different emphases. One year and then they change. But I think generally speaking, the FDA has gotten a little bit easier to work with over the years. But it's highly situational which department you work in, which life science segment you're trying to get an approval on. And some are easier than others. And I think the first step is just kind of knowing the regulatory pathway you're pursuing and the challenges.
Okay, so you're advocating for life science entrepreneurs to get a hold of a good grasp of the regulatory pathway at the very beginning. I mean, as soon as you're thinking about an invention, you're thinking about a market, you have to be thinking about your regulatory pathway.
Yeah, and it's almost, as I would say, the top three things a new company entrepreneur needs to do is, characterize, as best as possible your asset, whether it's a, new chemical entity, try to get, besides the basic physical chemistry, some characterization data, and maybe an in vivo, in vitro system, or if it's a medical device, create the spec, the product profile. Second item is, ensure that there's an IP path forward. The third item is, which is often overlooked, is get some preliminary regulatory readout, regulatory strategy that could be at minimally having in-depth discussions with two or three regulatory specialists, whether regulatory attorney or regulatory expert, and ideally have a pre-sub meeting with the FDA. Because, there's some paths through the FDA that are a little bit easier than others. Like for oncology, the FDA has actually made it easier because they recognize the need for life-saving drugs. For class 2 medical devices, the FDA Office of Drug Evaluation is actually pretty reasonable. For class 3 medical devices, the FDA's general perspectives and requirements are quite onerous. So you almost have to figure out early on what's the feasibility and the requirements for the FDA for a regulatory path, and use that as an input into your strategy.
Got it. Something that you mentioned is the three issues is make sure you have a clear description of the asset, have an IP pathway. You've got to own patents and have a strategy there, licensing or developing it on your own. And third is this regulatory, which is quite unique to FDA regulated products. That I think that the life sciences are regulated. I don't know, like the oil and gas industry, the government has to monitor every aspect of it and make sure that we're being safe. Anyways, what are some resources, or where could we find, or do you have any tips for finding the right kind of consultants or specialists for regulatory pathways? What strategy do you use to find the right people?
Well, there's no dearth of seasoned regulatory experts and consultants out there. Usually just using through an entrepreneur or through, 1 or 2 levels of connections, you're going to meet the right person to guide you. And the big advice I would give is, just don't rely on one expert, get the advice of 2 or 3 people, then generally you're going to have to come to one of 2 decisions. Do we have a pre-sub meeting that creates some definition on this, or do we spend some time and effort developing the technology and then go to the FDA? There is a third path, which is try to look for a surrogate and see what another company has done going forward, whether it's a drug or a device, and kind of get a sense of what the regulatory strategy has been through the FDA through one of those 3. But that's really the path forward. So I think identifying a regulatory person, an expert, a guidance wasn't that difficult. But then it's really trying to make that hard decision on, do you kind of spend some capital and time advancing the technology, or do you go early into the FDA? And I'll give you an example.
Okay.
I was working on a class 3 medical device, and we had a pretty strong preclinical and feasibility study, human data, that we had done in a different country. And we were going to use that preclinical data and also that human clinical data and go and have a dialogue with the FDA about doing a pivotal study path, right?
Okay.
When we spoke to a few regulatory advisors, and we didn't just speak to one, we spoke to a couple regulatory advisors who are non-attorneys, and then we got referred to a regulatory attorney who had expertise with this group in the FDA. Basically, the consensus was, you can go to the FDA, but you're going to hear about a very difficult clinical and regulatory path requirement, and then it's going to be documented in FDA minutes. You probably don't want to do that, right? So then the course of action was, do we gather more information? Do we give up on the technology, or do we find another path? And in our case, we decided to try to pursue the development in Europe. So that's another dimension. It doesn't always require a necessity to do everything in the US, right? Some of your studies, preclinical, clinical, or even your pivotal studies can be done elsewhere. And, many, for example, drug companies might do an early human feasibility study, phase 1 clinical in another country, and then come to the US for their proof of concept studies. So these are all the things that you need to think through, and a good regulatory advisor and an experienced management team should be able to guide a company in this regard.
Very helpful. And, I just was at a meeting with Device Alliance, and I ran into a lot of regulatory folks who are from OCRA, the Orange County Regulatory Affairs Association. Big group, well connected. And I think that we are surrounded by lots of great regulatory folks here in Orange County. So my market is primarily Southern California, but for those of us outside of Orange County and looking for regulatory specialists, look to regulatory affairs groups in Minnesota, in Boston, in San Francisco. I'm trying to think of the places that are well known for medical device in the US, even in Memphis for orthopedics. So the regulatory pathway, thinking about when the pathway is difficult in the US, entertain opportunities to get clinical data, human clinical data outside the US, and then how do people leverage those studies from outside the US to get into the US, or do you use that as a pathway to meet milestones, increase the value of the company, and talk with strategic partners, get an exit, try and do another capital raise? I know I'm throwing out a lot of different.
That's good. That's a good question. So oftentimes, let's start with the ex-US studies. Even if your eventual market is the US, which almost 95% of the case, when you see US-based companies, US-based entrepreneurs, the ultimate goal is to get an FDA approval, whether it's a PMA or a new chemical entity NDA approval. It's to get to the U.S. approval, just because the pricing in the U.S. Outside maybe some select countries like Japan or others is so much higher than anywhere else. The risk reward ROA profile is a U.S. business model. Now, having said that, oftentimes investors and capital providers, one of the key de-risking elements they look for is human data. And the preference, obviously, is to have US data generated through an FDA study. But
Right.
if that FDA study is going to be, twice as long, 3 times as costly as getting human data elsewhere, there might be some benefit. And I can talk to you about, numerous companies that I've worked on, both on the drug and device side, have done some studies in other countries. And some of countries, you first got to make a decision. Am I open to a developing world country, or do I want to be in kind of a first tier, we'll call it Western level medicine country? And there's pros and cons of each. As an example, Australia is a first world nation with an advanced medical system comparable to the United States. And they've created a facilitated regulatory path, both for drugs and devices, for early feasibility and phase 1 studies to be conducted in Australia. And they give tax credits, and there's many advantages to working there. They have a facilitated regulatory pathway because the government of Australia has made a kind of geopolitical decision that they want to attract this industry to the US. So we did some early studies at some of my previous companies in Australia, and some of which would meet the standard of an input for FDA. Some of it was just peripherally interesting for the FDA as a support primarily for safety application. But for investor purposes, it showed a dramatic showed an improvement in an efficacy profile and a safety profile, and it was human data. And oftentimes investors don't care where your first 10, 20 patients came from, as long as the study is done to ethics committees, IRB standards, FDA standards, and well-designed clinical protocol.
Very, very interesting. And I like that a lot, just being strategic and meeting some sort of a milestone to, objectively raise valuation or have the opportunity for an increased valuation, and maybe a different round from friends and family to a seed round, an A round, or a B round. Is there some sort of round numbers to help us, people outside who don't know the space, going to Australia to do a safety first in man or get some clinical data? Is this tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands, how many millions of dollars versus something in the United States or versus in Europe? Do you have a way of quantifying that or getting us inside?
Okay, I do. So I'll give you some ballpark numbers. First of all, the generalized assumption is that your preclinical package, whether it's the encompassing information on biocompatibility, manufacturing scale up, that your production processes were based on GMP, you use good laboratory practices for your in vivo and in vitro data. You had an FDA GLP vivarium conduct your animal model testing. You've run through the ISO compatibility studies, and you've done all the relevant preclinical work necessary either for an IND or an IDE, similar to what you would do, maybe not to the exacting standards of the FDA, but that the preclinical package is robust. Then, with that assumption in place, if you were to go somewhere to, let's say, another, we'll call it Western medicine location to conduct your studies, such as Australia or Europe, for a phase 1 or a pilot study, a device pilot or a drug phase 1, I think you can probably conduct a study of around 10 patients at 2 to 3 sites for probably $1 million to $2 million total external cost. And what I include in that is the CRO fees. Those are the hospital ethics committee and IRB fees. Those are the required in-country registrations, right? They would also, those fees, or those quotes that I'm including, also cost some transportation, logistical requirements, in-country insurance, and related. So the European, Australia, other we'll call first world medicine countries will probably be, my personal experience, half of what the US would be.
Okay.
Now, you can go to developing world nations, that'll be much less, but then the data is suspect.
Okay. Yeah, of course. Of course. Interesting. So that's really interesting with your experience in Australia. Do you have any, I don't know, pitfalls, funny stories on obtaining clinical data? Any anecdotal stories that are warnings for people? And I'll give you a funny one that I experienced in 2007. I had worked with a company, and we were approached by some people who purchased a Class 3 medical device, and under a CE, it was approved in Europe, and they used it in an Asian country, and they had data on over 40 human subjects. And how they did it, I don't know. They just created data on their own, and they approached the company and said, hey, we've got clinical data on 40 people. Would you like to buy this information? And we just kind of all hit the brakes, and we're like, whose idea was this? And this was done sua sponte, outside of the company. Absolutely no one in the company had anything to do with this. And it was just an opportunistic clinician in a foreign country thought, hey, I'm going to buy this product, I'm going to use this product, and then I'm going to generate data, and I'm going to see if I can sell it back to the company. And it was without any ethics committee. It was an approved product, but it was shocking to me that outside the US, this was some sort of a business strategy. And so I'm bringing this up as a warning to folks that, keep track of your product and all of your shipping, and maintain controls, and be aware that there's unscrupulous people who don't necessarily have a bad intent, but don't have any idea about the impact for future regulatory outside of their country where they have an approval. Do you have any experience or anecdotal stories on pitfalls or risks that people don't know about?
Well, in relation to ex-US, and whether it's in the R&D stage or the commercial stage, and commercial stage could be either using a distributor or direct selling, you carefully reflect upon the fact that not all countries in the world have the same rule of law and protection of IP, trade secrets, and same sacrosanct view of contracts that the United States has, right? And what we might take for granted in, establishing a service relationship with maybe either a hospital or a CRO or a distributor, it doesn't work that way elsewhere. And in some countries that I've experienced, particularly some Asian countries, recognize that even though you sign a contract, doesn't mean that the money is going to be exchanged during the terms of contract, or they're going to adhere to that. And the golden rule, of course, is particularly for business done in China, you have to get the money up front, right? A kind of contingent payment or recognition, it is just, it's neither right or wrong. That's not their necessarily interpretation of contracts, it's relationship. So I had a funny experience where I was a CEO of a life science company. This was a while back, and we had done a binding term sheet. So we hadn't signed a contract, but with an Asian company. And I think I can say this. It was a Chinese company, and they had insisted that I make a visit to visit their manufacturing facility and their hospitals. And I thought it was a perfunctory meeting to just sign the contract because we already had a binding LOI and term sheet. I show up at their main offices, which was adjoining a hospital. They had this red carpet. They had this little band. The whole hospital was lined up as if I were a head of state instead of this, little struggling startup who was making sales and just got an approval. And I treated like the head of state, and it was wonderful. They had all these events. And then I said, okay, where's the contract? Where should I sign? And they're like, it became apparent I was there to negotiate a transaction. And it took me a few hours to realize that. And then I said, no, we've already agreed on all the terms. We have a binding LOI. Our term sheet is in place. We're just here to work out some of the legal boilerplate. And that was a shock. They wanted to negotiate and modify all the terms that I thought were already existing. And make a long story short, we had another day or two of fun events, but I didn't sign any contract. And I kind of went back to the United States with my tail between my legs, trying to explain to the board what happened, right? Wow. So as you work or elsewhere, it's critical you get international counsel who has a linkage to your American counsel on how laws and regulations and interpretation of contracts actually work there, because some places respect contracts in the same way that America does, others do not.
That's a hilarious story to me, Niv. And I actually had a very similar story. I was counsel to a medical device company and coincidentally it was China, but I work with companies that work all over Europe and Middle East and Asia. And the CEO flew over to China and essentially had a red ribbon, a cutting of the ceremony. And he too thought he was just showing up to sign this $5 million contract. And it wasn't. His expectations were, we've got this LOI, I'm flying over. They've got this huge ceremony. Everybody's in their outfits, they're cutting the ribbon. And we're doing this joint venture in China. And after the pomp and circumstance, he's like, okay, great. Where's the contract? Where do I sign? And, he Skypes me at, some hour, 15 hours ahead of time for me. And I get on this call and he's like, they didn't have the contract ready. What's going on? And I, was a little bit surprised. He's leading the negotiations. And so that's a very important lesson when negotiating outside the U.S. to have a good contact, a legal contact, a cultural education to understand the norms of negotiations. And different countries have different reputations of not just, there are some countries that you sign the agreement and then after you send the check, that's an invitation to start negotiating again.
Right. You hit it on the head.
So I've seen that. And I think that's a valuable lesson for entrepreneurs who have not gone outside the U.S. yet to engage with people and learn about the culture and negotiation styles and strategies, because they are very different outside the U.S.
Agreed.
That
Yes.
was funny. Any other? So that we've talked a lot about regulatory and how it tangentially can affect finance and that kind of a strategy. What about maybe some, I don't know, personal tips or skills? How do you're very engaging, you're a great listener, you always have insights on what people are asking for that I don't catch the first time around. And so in approaching an investment strategy, what are some things that you can teach or give tips? Because some of it is experience, right? And education and understanding and messing things up and learning. But what are some easy tips or pitfalls that people in approaching not maybe friends and family, but also venture capital or private equity in raising money to start this very capital intensive medical device or pharmaceutical company?
Yeah, great question. It's funny, is I often tell people the I think about industry, at least it's called life sciences, and most people think about in the segmentation of medical device, pharma, therapeutic area, but I really think about it more on kind of capitalization and stability stage, where there's revenue generating companies and companies that are imminently about to get a FDA approval, and then companies that are more in the research and development or early clinical stages. It's really the most natural segmentation in when you think about healthcare capitalization and fundraising, because the former category, they're either public, or if they're not public, they're generating enough revenue that they can get venture debt or private placements pretty easily, essentially collateralized or securitized by their income and revenue streams. The early stage companies, it's all about constant capital raising. Now, as you think about that initial formation of the idea and getting going, you've really got to identify where the trends are and where the both venture, private equity, high net worth individual, family offices are on their thinking on that kind of industry segment. So I remember when I first got into biotech and medtech around 15 years ago from big pharma. If you were in research, if you were in genomics, if you were in anything innovative in R&D, that was where the money was going. There was lots of money. People wanted big ideas. Now it's kind of gone the opposite. Everyone wants a late stage idea, something close to liquidity event within 2 or 3 years, or something that could generate revenue, or a very strong regulatory pathway that'll get you to either an exit or an approval. So I think one has to think about that very clearly and almost avoid businesses and ideas that don't have that path of liquidity or an FDA approval within some reasonable time period. Okay. The next thing is, when you think about this, there's a lot of art in fundraising. It's more art than science. And I reflect upon my business school career. The only class, you take all the fundamentals, marketing, finance, accounting, microeconomics, macroeconomics. There's no class in fundraising. That concept is alien. You have to pick it up. And there's a lot of tricks of the trade you learn the hard way. First of all, fundraising is much, much easier if you have an institutional investor in your cap table created funding provided some initial capitalization. If you don't have an institutional investor that you can anchor around, it's harder. So generally, one trick of the trade is try to get some reputable, institution. It doesn't have to be Kleiner Perkins or Essex Woodlands or some big name. It could be just some local private equity VC company or a family office. But having that anchor really does help, right?
Okay.
I think the other thing is it's difficult when there's a perception that the founders and investors haven't actually put in capital themselves. I think people who invest in money, whether they're seed, friends, or family, want to know that the investors have put more, or the founders have put more than their just time. So that's another thing to think about. If you're the CEO or CFO and you're trying to raise money, I've also found it very difficult if you're trying to go point A, which is you as a CEO or the CFO, directly to an investor at point C and make a pitch for capital. Generally, human nature being what it is, investors want to get the deal credentialed through some intermediary. And even if they know you as the CEO or the CFO or board chair, they want to get an introduction through someone else they might know, because then they're hearing it from someone who isn't as biased. And ideally, that intermediary is also investing in the company. So there's around a dozen tricks of the trade that I've learned the hard way about trying to raise your capital, and that's that. I will also say, there's pros and cons of being a public company versus being a private company, and I've spent my career kind of halfway in both. Even though the requirements are much more difficult in terms of maintenance of standards as a public company, it's the way to go. Because there's an old adage in biotech, medtech, which I think after all these years is the most relevant. No life science company ever fails. They just run out of money, right?
That's awful.
And think about that. If you're a public company, you can always do an ATM or a follow-on or a pipe or registered direct. And you're going to have ease of executing those, assuming you have a competent management team. Primarily because even though you're a struggling public company, you have liquidity for the investors. Private companies don't have that.
Okay, that's excellent advice. I learned something about capital strategies from you. Very valuable. Gosh, I wish you had something that would excite entrepreneurs to get out there, but I'm hearing, it's tough. You've got to have, it's not a great idea that gets funded. It is relationships and capital that brings a product to market. It's not just a great idea or a great clinical idea that can actually help save lives.
Yeah, Eric, you said it very well and apropos. Probably the most unfortunate paradox about the life sciences is there are many companies with great technologies and ideas that don't get to the surface. And then there is other companies and technologies that are quite honestly mediocre, but they get powered through a clinical study and get on the market. And it's probably the single biggest misconception of entrepreneurs and new company formation is, if I just have a great idea, I have a great technology, I have a patent, and there's a market, I should be able to get there. It unfortunately doesn't work that way. It's often about your connections, your access to capital. Are you able to navigate a regulatory path? And the single best thing I always advise young companies to do is surround yourself with a menagerie of experts in different skill sets and different perspectives, and to help navigate that. So have someone on your board who is a great networker, might not have a lot of knowledge about the life sciences or, development of a pharmacophore, but he has connections to capital markets or high net worth individuals. Have someone on your team who is a good regulatory person. Have someone on your team who has experience in general management. Have someone on your team who has expertise in that industry segment. So this diversification of knowledge, functions, abilities are really what's key, because you never know what's going to happen, and having that spectrum of expertise and capabilities on your board, advisors, company is what's needed.
Wow, that's excellent. I completely agree with you. I'd like to, I know we're running up, we got a few minutes left. I want to change gears real quick. I was hoping you would say something like, well, the neurovascular or the kidney space or point of care, there's government subsidies and people are throwing money at these industry segments rather than separating the funding levels and saying this is the stage of the company, a couple of years from profit, or I've reached milestones in the regulatory pathway. I was hoping you would say something like, here is an industry that has a lot of growth, people are pouring money into, and I've seen it in other industries for raising money in software. It used to be Internet of Things, then it was crypto or ledgers, some sort of a technology with, Bitcoin or related technology, and now we're looking at AI or general artificial intelligence technologies. Is that impacting the healthcare space, point of care? Has it made its way into those industries yet? Or is there any area that you're familiar with right now where there's lots of opportunity and people are putting capital in?
That's a good question. I mean, the short answer is yes. You mentioned a couple of them. AI is hot. Prior to that, it was orphan diseases and targeted oncology therapy. Part of this are trends. There's always different trends that are flowing around where capital is hot. In the life science, it was genomics for a while, and new target development. Then it was kind of 510K devices. Then it was kind of dermatology and aesthetics. Then it was targeted oncology. Then it was CAR T and orphan. Now it's, of course, AI. Talking to a private equity friend of mine, partner at a private equity firm, and he says literally every company that comes through says they're an AI company. Whether they're in IT, they're in drug development, they're in commercial stage, they're a medical device, everyone's an AI company. So everyone's trying to get on these trends, so it is probably right now AI related technologies. Cancer is always going to attract money and capital just because, fundamentally our healthcare system is broken. And as part of our broken system, the government and payers reimburse for specific drugs and devices in a different manner than others. And for orphan and small population diseases and cancer, you can still price at $100,000, $50,000 to $100,000 a year therapy, and other technologies you can't, or because there's a high procedural code, something like cardiovascular, cardiac failure, whether it's for heart valves, LVADs, etc. You can price at very high levels. So part of what's hot, to answer your question, is somewhat what the government and our healthcare system will reimburse. Because if you kind of extrapolate on your budget and plan and you get to the profit and loss post FDA approval, a large part of that component is not traditional volume or market share, it's price, and the price is dictated essentially about what the government is going to reimburse. So as you think about what's hot, you should first think about what can I price at a adequate level to recoup all these development costs. And certain therapeutic segments allow you to still price high, and therefore they're hot, and others are not.
I agree. That's again, entrepreneurs, you've got to start off your process from the perspective of an exit and reimbursement, or the cost of goods, the sale price less the cost of goods, and not, man, that's disappointing. But you really have to look at this business from the end, not just the beginning. And I like looking at all the opportunities at the beginning personally, but do you see anything, or are there any industries or trends that you are an advocate for, or any opportunities you want to share with people on things they should be looking for in the near term?
Well, and I've got to apologize, I only have a few more minutes, but I would say that the main area that one should look for, besides just pricing and big markets, is thinking about the cost to get there. It is usually the capital requirements to get to new drug or device development are so onerous. It's critical to plan that out, because that's one of the worst things one could do, is expect to get from the current preclinical IDE or IND stage to approval is some fraction of what it really costs. So there's almost an opportunity in smart, budgeting and planning to get there. But the other areas, as I indicated, I'm still a big proponent of derm aesthetics markets. I think there's a large way to go, and a lot of opportunity in targeted oncology. And I think it's unclear where AI is going to help healthcare, but I think certainly maybe claims processing, physician support, providing physicians assisted support, and maybe also some culling of data prospectively of what patients are at risk, but you have to have access to kind of the health plans and the health IT. The health IT groups have to have access to some sort of database to cull that data. So
Awesome.
That's my view. And I just want to let everyone know I've worked with Eric now for 20 years. He's a great IP and contract attorney, but what really makes him unique amongst many attorneys I found is he's a problem solver. He just doesn't, Eric, what's been wonderful about you when I go to legal situations is you just don't always give me the most conservative answer, which is no, or put your head in the sand, but coming up with real kind of legal to business solutions. So you've been great at that. Thank you for all your help over the years. And glad we had a chance to talk.
Thank you, Niv. Appreciate you. And we'll connect real soon. Is there any, what's the best way for people to reach out to you if they want to get a hold of you? Are you open to people reaching out to you? What's the best way?
Probably LinkedIn or through you. Those are probably the best ways. Just send me a LinkedIn message or through you.
Awesome. I'll make sure that people can reach out to me and find out how to get a hold of you. Thanks so much, Niv.
Have a great day.
Stay tuned for our upcoming episodes, where we'll cover topics ranging from business formation and fundraising to contracts and compliance. Subscribe now and never miss an episode of Business Problem Solvers. Business Problem Solvers podcast is proudly brought to you by Eric B. Alspaugh, APC, providing comprehensive legal solutions for startups and entrepreneurs. Visit our website at www.alspaughLaw.com to learn more. Disclaimer: the information provided in this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only and should not be construed as legal advice. Consult with a qualified attorney or legal advisor to address your specific legal needs.